All right, this is a quick talk through of my slides from Western civilization at Mahidol University. World wars, how do they change the world? We will not even begin to talk about how much they changed the world. I hope to give you a good sense of how important they are without spending nearly enough time on it. Okay. So World War I, an Archduke got shot by revolutionaries. They blamed it on one country, who blamed it on another country. There were 500 different alliances that were happening all at once. Everybody was related to one another. Everyone was a Habsburg. The leaders of all of these countries were cousins or second cousins, and everything used to be in this situation where war was almost like a game. You exchange a few territories in the end. World War I was something that no one was ready for. The amount of death, the amount of hopelessness, the sheer insanity of it all was something that nobody could see coming. And if they could have seen it coming, I think they would have done a lot better. Another way that World War I is seen is as a failure of leadership, because a lot of these people were allowed to run these countries simply because they inherited them, and they were not necessarily talented. And that's not true of all people who inherit countries. Sometimes people inherit countries and they do a great job. In this case, not so much. Okay, so this was the First World War. Of course, they didn't call it that at the time. They called it the Great War. Sometimes they called it the war to end all wars, and it didn't end all wars. And remember the term Eurocentric, right? So it was, of course, a world war because it was happening in multiple places, but it was mostly centered around Europe. And if you look at wars by death toll, there are wars that outrank the First World War. The thing that's very impressive to people is particularly the Western Front, which was the front between Germany and France, where the British and French troops for years were fighting the Germans. And this front was horrifically bloody, and it would just move like dick, 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 because the defense in this war was so powerful, and the offense was so hard to do, so people didn't gain a lot of ground. Multipolar Europe is what we were looking at before the First World War. The reason that this is important to say is that for a while we've dealt with a world where you have the United States and Russia were the two main superpowers, and capitalism and communism were the two main ideological powers. So that's kind of the world that my parents grew up in, and it was a paradigm that lasted for a very long time, from the Second World War up until pretty much the end of the 20th century. That was the world that we were living in, was the Cold War period, where you had two superpowers, and now we really have one superpower as far as the military is concerned. How long will the United States last? Who knows? So in multipolar Europe, France, Britain, Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Germany were all first-rate powers. They were all really super strong. And the reason that I wrote that the Russians have a Tsar and the Germans have a Kaiser is to highlight the connection to the Roman Empire. Both of those words come from the word Caesar. So the Tsar was Caesar, which meant unquestioned ruler. In Germany, the Kaiser was the Caesar, which meant, of course, unquestioned ruler. These were places that were not democracies, and these were democracies, and they will criticize, particularly the United States will criticize Russia and Germany and say, they don't want that to happen for a multitude of reasons that we talked about earlier. So what was happening before World War I? Countries were increasing their military capabilities and starting to turn arms over to the people. That didn't happen before. Arms means weapons. That didn't happen before because the ruling class didn't want to give the people weapons, because the people would use weapons against the ruling class. And they definitely didn't want that to happen. The Archduke Ferdinand rode through the streets in an open car. They tried to assassinate him, and they failed. He later went to go visit the people who got hurt in the assassination attempt. They took a wrong turn, and the assassin was just coming out of a cafe and saw his target, walked up and shot him. So the assassin was a 19-year-old kid affiliated with Young Bosnia. So this turned the south of Europe into a giant blame war because he was the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, and you can't go killing somebody like that. So the actions of people got wrapped up into the actions of nation states. And then what people realized really fast was there was a lot of alliances that meant if you go to war with me, I'm going to go to war with you. If you go to war with me, I'm going to go to war with you. This guy is often seen as kind of the match that lit the flame that blew up all of Europe. Old times, we had a notion of limited warfare. New times, we have a notion of total warfare. This is very interesting. This is very important because in old times, you definitely didn't bomb civilian targets. In old times, if you lost, the general would hand over his sword. Well, jolly good day to you, sir. You were stronger, your drummers were drumming, and you had more spirit. But in total war, planes fly over and bomb people's houses, because if you can knock the home front out of the equation, you can get the people to not want to be at war anymore because bombs are falling on their cities. You are winning. So you get to the point where people are willing to try to win a war by any means necessary. Okay. So in the home front, the population is a target. In World War I, one of the ways it was marketed was with beautiful women going around and pinning white feathers to any able-bodied man they would see. And this is because most of these guys, if you were an athletic, well taken care of guy, you should be out there with a rifle trying to go over the top and kill the enemy. And if you weren't doing that, but I'm a doctor. Well, get out there and start dying for your country. And this worked really well. Nobody wanted to be seen as a coward, so everybody was joining up. In total war, technology was so important that you had to be creating millions and millions and millions of bullets and shells. These are shells. They're giant bullets that go into artillery cannons, and they explode when they hit the ground. Sometimes they explode before they hit the ground. A lot of them would carry gas and chemical weapons. Some of them would just explode into fragments that military people refer to as frag. And they're flying shards of metal. And the thing that's so horrible about them is that they don't just kill people, they will cut pieces off of people or destroy part of your face. They're really horrible. Really, really horrible. Also, when you are fighting somebody who's dead on right in front of you, that's one situation. But if you are fighting somebody who can just blow you up out of nowhere, it's so much more terrifying. It leads to so much more stress. All right. Now, let's talk about the American Revolution. So the American Revolution of 1776 was revolutionary for a lot of different reasons. That's when the Americans said, we don't want to be British anymore. They declared independence, and they fought the British with guerrilla war. The redcoats were the British army. They wore red coats. So, can you spot the British soldier? Yeah, they're pretty easy to see, right? So you could see where they were really easily. Now, with guerrilla war, guerrilla war, there's a guerrilla warrior right there. They look more like this, right? You have people camouflaging in. So this looks more like a sports team going out to play a soccer match. This looks like a military that we understand now, and it's because you're trying to kill the enemy by any means necessary. You're not following rules. We're going to wear red, you better wear blue, because we don't want to have any confusion about who's going to take the first volley. Look up Polite War and watch that video again if you missed it, because that was wonderful. Because look at this. These are just obvious targets, and these are men trying to blend in and hide. Okay. So limited war had rules, and total war changed everything. Arming the people was really one of the huge things, and the other thing was turning the entire country into a war machine, turning all these factories into places to make as many bombs as humanly possible. There were stories in Germany about the church bells being hauled out of these ancient churches and melted down to make shells, and the parishioners, the people going to church, and the priests would give funeral rites to the bell before it would go off, because it's a bell that had rung people from cradle to grave for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in old Europe, and they were being melted down to go fire at the British and French. The technology, indeed, was horrifying and staggering, and is something that nobody was ready for before, because all of your ideas of what courage should be were over with. Because if you try to charge this, it's going to kill all of you. It's a machine gun. And if you put a bunch of sandbags down in front of it, you can't shoot the guy who is killing you all with the machine gun. So you have to dig into the ground, get your own machine gun, and fire. Then defense rules, right? Because you're sitting down there waiting for guys to come up, and you can just kill them all. These things were sinister. They were new, and people didn't know how to deal with them yet. So often they would say, all right, we're going to charge because we're bored, or because, the generals say we have to claim this territory, and they would just feed themselves to the machine guns. Sometimes they'd be able to take a little bit of time, take a little bit of distance, but more than often, people just got chewed up by this. Also, there were these giant guns that would launch exploding shells, and they would fire millions of these things at a time and just absolutely destroy everything. The artillery rounds are called shells. Sometimes they say shelling, and that means shooting millions of these things. Sometimes they were big enough to be launched from trains, and they were long range enough to fire for miles. So World War I was where these cannons became just unbelievably effective. And again, defense was important because these things are very difficult to move, and defense always ruled, especially on the Western Front. So some techniques that came up were things like trench warfare. If you have just the whole air is just steel rain, then the moment you stick your head up, you die. This is the way you have to fight all the time. So it turned into a situation where armies would dig these trenches, they would dig in, the opposing army would be on the other side with trenches, and in between they call this no man's land. And the reason it was no man's land is the moment these guys would say, all right, it's time to charge, go over the top, and they would go over the top, people would just immediately, usually 100% of people would die. And the people who didn't die would be laying there out in no man's land, screaming and dying. And then some brave soldier would come up and try to save his friend and die. World War I was more horrible than anybody had the imagination to come up with. Nobody could know how horrible World War I was going to be. They lived in these trenches for months and months and months. In the past, if there was a battle, that battle could be horrible and bloody for a few hours, and then you went home. In this situation, the battles, you can't even call them battles. They were just months and months and months of living in these situations, going to the bathroom in these situations. You can't go out and poop somewhere else. You got to poop in your trench. Sometimes they were happy to have stolen some German helmets because they had a big spike on the hat and they could stick that into the ground, and that was a nice toilet for them. But really, there was nothing nice. This was living in as close to hell as anybody has been able to describe, and all accounts of World War I just talk about how horrible it was. It's often overshadowed by World War II because World War II is, for many people, for most people, World War II is like the worst of humanity. It left an even darker mark on humans than World War I. Barbed wire was a very new weapon because they would line the fields with this barbed wire, and then they try to destroy that with artillery, but the people would get tangled up in the barbed wire, they wouldn't be able to continue to go. It would slow down their advance long enough for machine guns and artillery to kill people. So the war machine became, it's always described by historians as a meat grinder. It was just like throwing human beings into a machine that would just eat life. But on Christmas of 1914, a very historic thing happened. The soldiers from either side came out and played football together. All along the line, you could hear people singing, and they kind of remembered that they were human beings, and they didn't actually want to kill each other, and they were kind of being forced to kill each other for something that they didn't really understand. All right. So things are happening. The nation state was a weapon, and people were instruments in the hands of this weapon. And the football helmet analogy that I gave you is that if you get smashed and knocked out right away, that's actually kind of better for you. But if you are well protected with like a football helmet, and you get smashed in the head over and over and over and over again, what we're starting to find is that people that play these sports end up getting their heads really messed up, because the fact that you can get back up because you have this armor on, it's actually worse for you than if you would have just, been smashed in one hit and done. And the same was true for these countries. Ancient countries, nations, states, if they lost a major battle, it was the end of them most of the time, because the cavalry would be able to sweep in, it would be over with. But nation states had been developed so much that their economies could take these massive punches. So what World War I did to these states was destroy them completely. All right. So shell shock. We're going to go back to Sigmund Freud just a little bit with this. Combat is not as scary as indirect fire. And this is because maybe you are looking across at somebody and you're looking at them in the eye. You know they're going to try to kill you. You're going to try to kill them. That's terrifying for a short period of time. But it's real. You know what you're dealing with. Humans have been doing this for a very long time. We understand single combat. We understand group against group combat. What we don't understand is what happens on the other side of right? You all of a sudden hear a whistling, and then all of your friends are dead 1 second later. There's no person to blame. It's as if the finger of God just came out and said, that one dies, and then they do. Now we have American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan are dealing with improvised explosive devices, IEDs. And they sit on the side of the road in like a garbage can or something. They wait for somebody to go by, and then they'll hit a button, and their bomb that they have made over there will blow up. So that's the biggest difference between these two forms of warfare. Not limited in total, but the difference between modern and ancient warfare is the time, and of course indirect fire. Indirect fire is like made to mess up the human mind because you don't have any control over it. In this case, if you lose the fight, then you may die or get really seriously hurt. But in this situation, you lose the fight in an instant. I have a friend who walked into a room, and all of a sudden, just everyone he knew was dead, and he just kind of woke up hurled against the wall. And there's nothing in nature, returning to this idea of evolution by natural selection, there's nothing in nature that has prepared the mind for what modern warfare can do to a human mind. So this idea, then the question, what makes a ghost movie scary? It's the suspense. You're waiting, and you're like, okay, oh no, what's happening? And of course, the music all falls out, and it's silent, and you're just waiting for a short period of time. You have this great anticipation building in you, and then all of a sudden, the ghost comes. It was much worse than that because they would be watching people get torn apart all the time. And there was this constant pounding of shells, and they were living in this horrible, horrible place. So shell shock was particular to the world wars because they were living in constant bombardment forever. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder, as Freud understood it, was a dichotomy between fright and dread. And I can use the tympanic membrane in the ear to kind of describe how it worked without using too many technical terms. He wrote this in German, of course, so the translations are different. He describes many different kinds of fear. For Freud, there was kind of a preparatory fear. Like if you're going out to fight an ancient war, you have bad guys on the other side, you and your friends on the other side. You're getting ready to go. You're anticipating. Oh God, let's go do it. You're getting ready, and all of your chemicals are getting ready for this. So when you go into that battle, you're going to see horrible things. Your friends are going to die. Maybe you're going to die. You're going to be afraid that you're going to die the whole time. You're going to be killing other people. All of this is horrifying, but you're able to get ready for it. You go into it for a temporary period of time, and then in the end, you go home. The problem with the world wars, was they were so sustained that you were never ready for what happened. Now, imagine the air. Let's say I had a speaker, right? Let's say this is a speaker. And you know that if I put this up to the speaker, you know that it's going to feed back and make a horrible noise. If I go like this and get ready to make this horrible noise for you, you will tense up. Another one is if I take this glass here and I get ready to smash it, when you see my arm in motion, your body will tense up, but also the muscle of the ear will tense up. See, this is like a muscle, and the way that the ear works is sound waves hit this, and it will go boom, like the skin of a drum. And if the skin of the drum is tight, it'll go whoa, just a little bit. But if the skin of the drum is loose, it'll go whoa, 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 right? So when you're in a bunch of loud noise, your tympanic membrane will stretch out and it'll get really tight. So when these hard, loud noises are hitting it, it doesn't blow your ear out. But if you're not ready for a loud noise and that loud noise happens, you're like, go! Right? It really startles you. And it's not just because you're not ready for it. It's because the signal is coming into your brain so much louder because you're not ready for it. You haven't stretched this muscle. Fear is the same way for post-traumatic stress disorder, at least the way Freud understood it. If you're a soldier and you're out there fighting and you're ready to fight, you're ready to kill, you're ready to die, you're ready to do horrible things that are at the limits of your possible experience, you're ready. So when horrible things happen, your soul is stretched, tensed, ready to take an impact. But if you're not ready, if you're not braced and stretched, and something horrible happens out of nowhere, it will hit you just way too hard because you're not ready for it. And this is what shells did to people. That's another video. So World War I caused 40 million casualties. Casualties means dead or wounded, and almost half of them were dead. Many were civilians. So what happened between the wars? The Russian Revolution, which we don't have time to talk about, unfortunately, but they turned into a communist nation. The Great Depression, which was a huge economic recession that happened around the whole world. We're going to, unfortunately, skip these things, look them up another time. So World War II. We're going to cover this with not enough time. Here's the way the world was squared off against each other. You can watch it happen. Germany and Italy were both fascist countries that were annexing other territories. England went around and tried to fight up here. Now at this point, Africa is inflamed in war. Of course, the Pacific Theater has been going on for even longer because Japan invaded China before World War II even started. Russia is not necessarily on the team until now, when they've got Hitler all over them. And at some point, Hitler had most of Europe. Hitler and Mussolini had most of Europe under control. But after a little while, the Americans joined the war. They started to push back. At some point, we're going to have the D-Day landings here. But the Eastern Front was the bloodiest conflict of all time, where Hitler tried to invade Russia during the winter, which is totally impossible. I think D-Day is showing up right about now. We're getting to 1943. There's a lot going on in Africa that we can't see right now. Here we go. They called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe, and at some point, at this point, I believe Italy has surrendered, and this is all German troops holding the line down here. Russia was on Germany's team in the beginning. I didn't know that. And here we had the D-Day landings, and at this point, both Russia and the Allies, everybody's pushing the Germans back, and now at this point, that's the end. So, Nazi ideology. I think I said before that Westerners believe that all ideas are important and you should give everybody a chance to speak and give everybody a chance to think. We believe in a multiplicity of many ideas. Even communism. You can go to a school, you could go to Harvard, and you could have a teacher who will openly say, I am a communist and I believe in communist ideas. And you say, teacher, why do you believe in those? And he'll use class time to explain to you why he's a communist. And the United States was recently, ideologically at war with communism. But the West will deal with communists. Be like, go ahead, you be a communist, that's fine. It's fine for everybody except for Nazis. If somebody says, I'm a Nazi, everybody says, you go home then. We're not cool with you. You're not allowed to have freedom of speech. You're not allowed in the marketplace of ideals. And the question that Westerners are always asking is it okay to punch a Nazi, right? And most people say, yeah. You don't need to debate a Nazi. We already know that they're wrong. Nazis are wrong forever, and we hate them forever. So here are some elements of Nazi ideology. You can pause this if you want it. They believed in a single leader, no democracy, and that single leader has all the power. Der Führer, ja. Autarky meant that Germany should be economically self-sufficient. It wasn't. It needed other things. Japan was in a similar situation. They had no natural resources, so they were out trying to get other people's natural resources. They didn't want to trade. They wanted to, do this colonization thing that they had learned so much about. A strong Germany. Now, the end of World War I, the treaty that was written was so much of a punishment against Germany for being the aggressor who started the war and then who eventually lost the war. So they got beat so bad. So Germans, it was very easy for Hitler to come in and say, this is unfair. You're being treated unfairly. Germany's a great place, and I'm going to make Germany great again, right? It was very easy for him to say that and people to get really into it. But he blamed the communists and the Jews who had to be destroyed, and that's the most infamous thing that happened in the 20th century would be the Holocaust or the bomb. Both of the atomic bombs dropped by the United States. Those are like the two greatest atrocities of the 20th century. Of course, somebody's going to argue with me about that, but those are the two that make World War II above and beyond everything else. It's the use of nuclear technology and the use of technique and technology and an entire nation state, an entire alliance coming together to murder man, woman, and child because of their ethnicity, mechanized on a super high scale. The Holocaust is something that you can study endlessly and just be horrified by what most, if not all, Westerners believe is the worst thing that has ever been done by humans. The Holocaust is what most people think in the West is the worst thing that was ever done by humans. And I think I've said before that most Westerners believe that Adolf Hitler is the worst person that there ever was, without a second, right? They don't like Stalin a lot, but they like communism enough to forgive him. But Hitler is synonymous with evil. Hitler is a synonym for evil, and Nazi is a synonym for evil in the West. So that's what Westerners think. Lebensraum means living space. They wanted, especially farmland, right? Europe is interdependent. They depend on one another through trade, and that worked out really well until World War I. But Germany wanted to be self-sufficient in the way that the United States is. The United States has a ton of land, a ton of natural resources. So it was very easy for the United States to point at everybody else and say, you guys are bad for doing colonialism. You guys are bad for having these wars where you try to take over these countries. Stop doing all that stuff. It's because the United States is self-sufficient. It's very easy for them to blame the European great powers. Social Darwinism is the last one. And social Darwinism is something that it's an idea that you could hold if you wanted to, but their version of it was that the Aryan race, white people with blonde hair and blue eyes, were superior, and other people, particularly the Jews, were subhuman. Now, I showed you in there, the Jews are less than 1% of the people on the planet, by far. Much less than 1% of the people on the planet. And I showed you that website that had all of the Jewish contributions to the arts, the sciences, medicine, really everything. And the only sense that you can get if you really look at it, you really study Jewish people as a race, if you try to be racist about it, the only conclusion that you can come to is that the Jews are actually exceptionally intelligent, creative, and productive. They have contributed to society, Western civilization in particular, far and away more than their small percentage of people. You know how the British make so much rock and roll? There's not very many people there. The Jews rock and roll. So Hitler had everything like completely backwards. And that's something Westerners do not ever forget. Okay. So genocide means the systematic slaughter of human beings based on their ethnicity or genotype. They first rounded them up into ghettos, took their property, took their houses, took the gold off of their fingers, and slowly but surely dehumanized them before sending them away to concentration camps, work camps, and death camps. All three existed, and some of them were all three of them at once, and some of them were just work camps, and then they had to be shipped somewhere else to be murdered, but they killed man, woman, and child. 6 million is the standard number. Is commemorated in a lot of art because to Westerners this is seen as to a lot of Westerners, most Westerners, this is seen as perhaps the greatest human failure of all time, the greatest failure of humanity, because it was using so much technology, bureaucracy in order to kill people, and not to kill enemies, but to kill civilians. This is the Holocaust monument in Germany. You're meant to walk through there and feel the impersonality of it. It's enormous, and everything. This is like, some people see this as just a reduction of humanity to logic, and it's just supposed to try to signify the horror of what happened. And then, cute kids, right? Yeah, we hate Hitler. So the Holocaust was the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, Roma people, political enemies, disabled people. We hate Hitler. The Holocaust is considered by Westerners to be the worst event in history. Adolf Hitler is considered by Westerners to be the worst person in history. Nazis and neo-Nazis, which means new Nazis, are considered to be following the worst ideology. And Westerners love freedom of speech, and we like to promote the marketplace of ideas. But it does not include room for Nazis. We don't like Nazis. So that is Western ideology, honestly. This is something that I have grown up thinking and that I still believe. If somebody tries to say, yeah, being a Nazi is cool, I will immediately not agree with them. I will immediately think that they're wrong, and I don't like have room in my mind to like listen to a Nazi and be like, oh, explain to me why the Aryan race is the greatest and we need to kill the Jews. Like I don't have space in my mind to believe that that person can be right. And it's because I'm a Westerner. Or it's because I'm right. So there was a lot of Ubergon equipment. It got better. Right? More death machines. People were fighting each other during all of this. More of the same artillery, only better. They also had battleships that went to war against each other. And finally, the tank. The tank was an answer to barbed wire, because barbed wire couldn't stop the tank. It was an answer to the machine gun, because it had heavy armor, and the machine gun couldn't kill the tank. It was also an answer to the trench, which the tank could just roll over. They weren't very fast. They moved at the speed of a walking man, and the really fast ones would move at the speed of a jogging man. But they were armored. They didn't get hung up by barbed wire. They didn't get hung up by machine guns. And in the past, if you had an enemy retreating, you would send your cavalry, which is people on horses. And the people on horses would ride them down, kill them with swords, kill them with whatever they killed them with, but they, would ride horses because they would have great speed. So now World War II brought offense back because you were able to chase enemies that were retreating. In World War I, you couldn't do that because horses would just die. Machine guns would take care of them. So tanks were an answer to trenches, machine guns, and barbed wire. Pretty cool, eh? The Russian front was the largest military confrontation in history. 30 million of the 7 million total deaths of World War II occurred on the Eastern Front, where the German army tried to invade Russia, which is what they wanted to do all along. In the beginning, when they invaded Poland, they appeased Russia by saying, why don't you take half of Poland, we'll take half of Poland. So Russia was happy to join in the spoils of taking Poland in the beginning of World War II, and then Hitler randomly attacked him, which is what his plan was to do all along. World War II deaths. You can read the blow-by-blow of how this all happened, and you could study World War II for months and never be done. But you have to write your test, and I have to send this to you, so we're skipping things. The Soviet Union suffered the most deaths, and most of the deaths that they suffered were civilian. They suffered the most civilian deaths. They suffered the most total deaths, but they did not suffer the most total deaths as a percentage of their population. Who wins that one? Well, it's either Lithuania, which so many of their people died. Looks like, I don't know what this percentage is, but it looks like well over half. Poland also. So many of their people died. This looks like 89% of Polish people died, right? It's a lot of people. There's a lot of people. So go through the amount of death that you have here. It's insane. This is a nice little graph here because it shows you who had the worst of it. And the axis is Germany, Italy, Japan, and others. Look how many of their civilians died. Only 4%. And this includes the United States dropping nuclear bombs. You look at Allied civilians, and this includes the Holocaust. 58% of the deaths of World War II were Allied civilians. The Allies lost more military. The Axis lost 13% of the military, and only 4% of civilians. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. The total number of deaths is estimated between 70 million and 85 million. It's an insane amount of people who died. Rosie the Riveter came out of this because just like World War I, we had to have a home front. So women ended up in factories making ammunition. And this icon here is still super famous. And a lot of women in the United States dress like this now. They try to rock this look. It's a good look. One question is this a war for food? Does not look good. Many of these places did not have enough food, and 20 million of the deaths in World War II were starvation. Many of those deaths were in Russia. And that's more people dying of starvation than the 19.5 military deaths. So an amazing amount of military people died. But even more people died by starvation during that time. Autarky, as I said before, is self-sufficiency. And if you look over here at the United States, they have so much farming land. You look at China, they have so much farming land. And the amount of resources that these places have, it's so much easier to be self-sustaining. Human population growth during this time was exploding, and everybody predicted that as the population grew, we were definitely going to starve to death. But what ended up happening was our technology kept up with us, and we were actually able to feed everybody better than ever before. Starvation has gone down, which nobody predicted. But nobody could predict that in the time. So a lot of people thought that we needed to reduce the population on purpose. Some conspiracy theorists believe that wars were started on purpose in order to do so. Okay, the Pacific Theater. We do not have enough time to really go into this. There is a series called Supernova in the East by Dan Carlin. I recommend anything that he does, but that's his recent series where he tries to talk about what led up to the bomb and what just basically the events surrounding the bomb. The Japanese, before World War II began, in World War I, they were on the side of the Allies against Germany. And mostly they just grabbed all of the German territories in this area, and they made out they were like the greatest winners in World War I. The United States and Japan were. They didn't lose very much, and they had actually gained a lot during that war, which is nobody else can say that. Everybody else lost so much. Europe was totally decimated by World War I. But what Japan was doing before World War II was going to war with China. And they weren't so much going to war with China as they were showing up there and killing a lot of people. So the Japanese, in order to protect their desire to have military campaigns here in Asia, they first did a preemptive strike and tried to take out the Pacific Fleet of the United States at Pearl Harbor, which of course brought the United States into the war. Also, it's important to say that 14 million of the deaths in World War II were Chinese. So China and Russia were both suffered immensely from World War II. So, luckily for the Americans, the Pearl Harbor raid did not destroy any of their aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers are very important because you can pull an aircraft carrier up and just wreak havoc on a place. By the time the United States had island hopped up to Iwo Jima and then to Okinawa, they were pulling their navy up closer and closer to Japan, and they were able to really start to hurt the country. They firebombed Tokyo and other primarily wooden cities in Japan, and all of that was super horrible before they even ever dropped a nuclear bomb. But in the European theater, the Allies did not trust Russia, and they wanted to put on a show of force. I just learned recently that just after suffering an insane amount of casualties and beating back Hitler, Stalin was ready to position the entire Russian army over here and help the fight against Japan. But the Americans were quite afraid that they were just going to take over Japan, and they were already quite afraid of the big bear in the east. So there are a lot of people who believe that the Americans using the nuclear bomb, it was trying to show Russia, we have this weapon. Don't you go trying to take over the world and make everybody communist. We don't want to be communist. This is a famous photo from Iwo Jima, the Marines taking the island. So even though things were going quite well, and the Pacific Theater was going very well for the Allies in general, technology went too far. This is the Manhattan Project. Albert Einstein, if Hitler hadn't have been such a crazy fool who hated the Jews, he would have been living in Germany, and he would have figured that all out for his own country, perhaps. But all of the brilliant Jewish intellectuals escaped, and this one helped build the nuclear bomb. Read about it. It's crazy. If you read any accounts of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it'll blow your mind. So there's Einstein. His name is synonymous with genius. He is, just as Hitler's name is synonymous with evil, his name is synonymous with genius. Einstein, if you say, oh, he is an Einstein, it means he's a smart person. Oppenheimer was he was perhaps even more influential, a physicist. When he saw the atomic bomb being tested, he famously said from the Bhagavad Gita, and this is on recording too, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, which is what Krishna says when he becomes the god Vishnu. I want to put this up again just to drive it home. So part of this is deaths from nuclear weapons. Okay. So there's a lot of negative things that come out after this. There was a strategic aftermath of the war. Operation Paperclip was when the United States went in and they would find all of the Nazi scientists, particularly the ones concerned with making rocket propulsion. And even though these were some evil, horrible people who had done evil, horrible things, they gave them jobs. The United States CIA was originally staffed by Nazis. This sounds like a conspiracy theory, but at this point, it's just history. Everybody knows that we just stole all of these evil geniuses and used them to build up our own military capabilities. The Russians had a very similar thing. They took the other half of the geniuses. The rat lines were another way that the higher-ups in the Nazi party, who were responsible for doing horrible things, but they weren't geniuses, they were just the political people, they would sneak out through Italy, and a lot of people who don't like the church try to remind them that the church was instrumental in getting a lot of Nazis out of Europe and into South America. A lot of them ended up in Brazil and Argentina and lived long and happy lives, even after their part in what everybody believes is the worst war that they could ever imagine. How have the world wars affected Western culture? Well, there's the beginning of a great sense of self-reflection and reconciliation where Western culture has come to grips with who and what it is. Stanley Milgram was a famous psychologist who basically the idea was when we saw what the Nazis were doing, we didn't think that these Nazis were all insane people. We thought that these Nazis were regular people who were being motivated by a horrible ideology to do horrible things. And the conclusion that everybody reached, not everybody, the conclusion that many people reached that they weren't seeing before, was that regular people can be made to do horrible things just by following orders. Stanley Milgram tested this with a psychological experiment where he would have an experimenter, and they would have a subject, and then this guy would be an actor, right? And they would ask the subject questions, and then like a quiz show or something. And at some point, the actor would get things wrong, and the experimenter would tell the subject, okay, shock him. And the only thing that they would say is, there will be no long-term neurological damage. There will be no long-term neurological damage. And what they would find is that these subjects, if this scientist in a lab coat was telling them, do it again, even if this actor would scream and cry, no, it hurts, please don't do it again, they would still shock all the way to 100% capacity. And these people would freak out. Like, of course, nothing was happening to them, but they would pretend that they were being really, horribly injured. But the experimenter would tell them, just keep going, please follow, please comply with you signed up for this, you have to do it, and they'd do it. So basically they were saying they were you could never do this today, but they were studying how easy is it to get somebody to torture another person. And what Stanley Milgram found was that it is very easy to get most people to torture another person. If they think that you're an authority figure and you're telling them what to do, they think that they're doing their job. It is very easy to get most people to torture someone. So Western civilization, the sciences, the arts, literature, all started to dig into the depths of the human soul, looking specifically for evil and finding so much evil in us. After witnessing the horrors of the world wars, these thinkers were not done. They wanted to find evil, and they believed that that evil existed in us. And then they started to prove that that evil existed in us in science. So I can't say this enough. They proved that it was very easy to make people torture one another. Another one is the Stanford prison experiment conducted by Dr. Philip G. Zimbardo. He still works today, and he's really fun to listen to talk. You can look him up. What he did was he took Stanford students, it's Northern California. They're as rich and lucky and peace-loving as you could ever hope for. And he made half of them prison guards and half of them prisoners. And he found that these people got so involved in their roles that they had to shut down the experiment after only a couple days because the prison guards were abusing the prisoners so horribly. And these were rich, educated kids. Not kids, they're 20 years old, 21, 22, 23. But they were just horribly abusing these people. Recently, there was a situation where American soldiers were abusing Iraqi prisoners in prisoners of war. And this same psychologist showed up to defend them, to say, hey, no, it's not. I have shown in my research that it's not the people personally. It's just if you put them in a situation where they have this authority, they will use it to be horrible. And then the judge believed that. Western civilization has gotten to a point where it is constantly finding evidence that humanity itself is evil, and that humans in particular, on the individual level, are evil. Lovely, right? Carl Jung, among his archetypes, spoke of the shadow. And the shadow is the part of yourself that is dark, that you cannot see. It is the part of you that wants evil, the part of you that would be satisfied being an Auschwitz prison guard, sending people to their death. And for Jung, you can't be actualized until you face the evil inside of you. So Westerners are quite metal. Westerners do feel this individually, right? People feel this on a personal level. Catholic guilt is something that's still, stuck in here. It's stuck in this. And the Protestant work ethic as well. They're both things that appeal to the sense of personal responsibility that one feels for the impact that Western culture has had on the world, which most people feel is not good. Amy Winehouse, you know that I'm no good. It's a great song. So Westerners seem to believe that mankind is evil. And Westerners also believe that Westerners are more evil than other people. So where Hitler had this racial superiority thing, the thing that has replaced it is that Westerners feel like Westerners are the worst people. All people are bad and Westerners are the very worst. To be honest, a lot of Westerners believe that. So here's a little taste of nihilism, and then we will have a little break. And it reaches to the stars. This is the Fermi paradox. They've recently figured out how many Earth-like planets there are. And there are so many that it is a number that nobody knows, right? This is 6 zeros. That number would be 1,000,000. So that number would be 1 billion, 10 billion, 100 billion. This would be 1 trillion, 10 trillion, 100 trillion. I believe this is called a quadrillion. So that would be 100 quadrillion. And I think this is a quintillion. And maybe this is a sextillion. So I think this is 19 sextillion, right? There's no currency in the world. There's no reason for this. You would express this number as 19 to the 25th power or whatever it is. How you count all the zeros. So that's how many stars that are similar to our sun that have at least one planet that's similar to Earth. That's how many Earth-like planets there are. What are the chances, based on how many Earths there are, that there would be aliens? And if there are aliens, what would the chances be that they have created technology good enough to explore and seek out other life? So the reason that this is nihilistic, that number is just so amazing. The reason that this is nihilistic is 2 reasons. Where is everybody? Because the overwhelming probability is that there is somebody out there, that we are not alone, that there are some kind of life elsewhere in the world. Why are they not here? There's 2 possibilities. One of them is that every time a society reaches the point where it can go out and explore everything and use technology in order to gain some kind of like superhuman immortality. And the idea is, rather than doing that, it goes all Black Mirror and starts to destroy itself socially, or it will build some sort of a weapon, like a nuclear weapon, and destroy itself that way. So that's one idea. That life in general is hostile to itself. And once we get these technological powers, every society there has been has killed itself. That's why we don't know where the Egyptians went. Maybe they killed themselves. Maybe we're all just these horribly suicidal things that boil up to a point where we're almost there and then we kill ourselves. Another possibility is that these aliens see us and they see what we're doing and they say, no, I don't have a lot of hope for them. Let's give them some time. Let's see what they can do. Let's see if they can create peace. Next, the Cold War.